Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Stephen Gottlieb of Jet and Young Israel of Ottawa, and I'm here today to have a fascinating conversation with David Curwin. David Curwin is an independent scholar who has researched and published widely on Bible, Jewish thought, philosophy, and the Hebrew language. His writings, both academic and popular, have appeared in periodicals such as Tradition, Hakira, and the Jewish Bible Quarterly. He blogs about language topics on balashon.com. He studied at Yeshivat HaKibbutz Dati and currently works as a technical writer in the software industry. Born in Massachusetts, he's lived in Rochester, New York, and San Francisco, but made his home in Israel since 1996. He resides in Efrat with his wife and family, and this is his first book, Kohelet, A Map to Eden, which is a fascinating work that shows how Sefer Kohelet, which we read on Sukkot, bridges into really a whole bunch of other places in Tanakh. It's a fascinating journey throughout, and I'll let the conversation explain exactly what that looks like and what it means. But perhaps the first question is, what exactly is Sefer Kohelet? We read it on Sukkot. It's kind of, let's say, thematically different than many other works that are within Tanakh. So what is it, and what are we doing reading it on Sukkot?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Rabbi Galli, for having me. I'll say a little bit more about why reading Sukkot maybe towards the end of our conversation, because I think at least my idea of why it is sort of has to do with how I understand the book. But in terms of what Kohelet is, for people who are not familiar with it, first of all, the English name is Ecclesiastes, which I can barely pronounce, let alone spell, so I'll continue to refer by the Hebrew Kohelet. It's one of the most philosophical books of the Bible. It has a lot of sayings, and they don't necessarily seem to be strung together in any sort of thematic way, like there were some more familiar with from some of the other texts. It's included in one of the five Megillot, but unlike the other Megillot, the other Megillot seem to all have some sort of narrative structure. Some are actual stories, like Ruth and Esther, and some are, maybe allegories, like Shir Hashirim is an allegory of the love between God and Jewish people, or some sort of love story, and Echa is the destruction of the temple, but also talking about how Jerusalem is kind of like a woman. Kohelet doesn't really have any of that. Maybe the closest book it's compared to would be something like Proverbs, Mishlei, but Proverbs, Mishlei, at least that's sort of a standard thing. Do good, things will be good. Do bad, things will be bad. Kohelet doesn't even have that kind of optimism. It just sort of says that almost nothing matters. And certainly one of the most famous expressions from Kohelet is that everything is vanity, everything's futile, depending on what kind of translation you use. So it's a difficult book to take apart. And it was a book that I personally had never thought that I was going to spend any time really approaching. It was something that for many years I really did not get much out of it. 1 year actually I broke my glasses, having fallen asleep in shul, banging my head during Kohelet on the desk. And so this is not something I ever thought that I was going to be writing a book about, but and so it happened.
So I guess on that note, I remember also on Sukkot, I didn't grow up particularly religious. I had no idea what this thing was. I just knew it was one of those books with one of those long names at the end of Tanakh. And on Sukkot 1 year in Shul, we started reading it, and I was just following along in the English translation. And I was actually drawn in the first year that we did because it was just so different than anything I would have possibly expected. I had no idea why it was even, I had no idea why we were reading. I had no idea why it was there. It was asking all these really depressing questions. I had no idea kind of what to do with it all. And I'm sure we'll get into, why it's written in that way. And it was just a very odd experience for me. And then in years following, I didn't really know what to do with it. It was still interesting, but it's kind of long, and if you don't know what's going into it, it's hard to really appreciate. So, I certainly feel I would not have thought that I would spend a lot of time really seriously thinking about Kohelet. And to your credit, something that the book really accomplished for me was giving me a reason to say, okay, now I can go back into it and really see what's going on, why it's doing this in the way that it's doing, and have a new layer of appreciation. But on that note, why did you decide to write on Kohelet in the first place? Because at surface level, it seems like a book that, you read a few times, you get a little depressed, you close it, you open it again next Sukkot. So what made you decide I'm going to spend time really digging in, finding all of these connections, and actually putting out a full book about it?
So it was 6 years ago, at this Sukkot. I came home from shul. I wasn't even actually at my own home. I was at a home of a family member who doesn't have the same library of books about biblical commentaries that I would usually have. So I even had less to go by. But I came back from shul again, kind of feeling like, oh, I got nothing out of it. And I said, I really need to. It can't possibly be. There's a biblical book that I'm going to get nothing out of every year. It just seemed crazy to me. So I just kind of opened the text and just started reading it. Now, again, I'm reading it in the original Hebrew. That gave me additional insights, especially into the linguistic uh, nuances that I might have otherwise missed. I was reading in translation. But what happened was I just started noticing connections between Kohelet and the first four chapters of Bereshit, of Genesis. And it was strange to me. I didn't know why they were there. I couldn't help but see them. Eventually, I discovered dozens of them, but I kept catching like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Now, it's important to note that for the number of years prior to that, I had been a student of, a fan of Rabbi David Foreman and his organization Aleph Beta, which spent a lot of time promoting the method of intertextuality, where you can take two texts and, based on the connections between each of them, gain insights into each. A very famous example of that would probably be the parallels between the Book of Esther and the story of Joseph, right? Because you find a lot of language things there, and there are also thematic connections there, palace intrigue and Jew in the courts and all that. So this is something that's kind of similar, and then by doing that, you can understand each story better. But so after I found all these connections and I tried to make a list of them, and I wasn't sure what to do, I said, well, there must be some. It can't just be a coincidence that there's all these connections. It wasn't just that the author of Kohelet was trying to make these trivial connections. There must be some reason for it, and so that was what I was trying to figure out next. Why was this happening? One thing we didn't note is that in the conversation so far is that Kohelet is traditionally ascribed to Shlomo Melech, the King Solomon, and that was what sort of gave me some insight into what might be going on there. And what my thesis initially was, and this is developed much in the book, was that there's a connection between Adam, who's as described in the first chapters of Bereshit, and Shlomo. They both have, in some ways, very similar lives. They both have kind of a universal scope in ways that was unprecedented by other biblical figures. Adam was certainly universal because of the first human, and Shlomo, of all the Jewish people, was certainly the most well-known and had reach all over the world, as he's described. They had a very special, intimate relationship with God in a special place. Adam in the Garden of Eden and Shlomo in the temple, and they both lost that through their own failings. And so, what I came to conclude was that, in a way, when Shlomo was writing this book, he was sort of echoing what Adam might have said in his life because he could identify with him. And I just went from there. Things just sort of, I don't know. In some ways, I oftentimes didn't feel I was writing it. I just felt I was pulling away the covers to find something that was already there.
Well, that's an amazing process when you're able to do that. It's also interesting, the methodology generally that you outline, because you often hear about so many scholars nowadays who say, it can't possibly be this book was written by this person, and we need to read it as a completely different work. But when you look at it and say, what if we just take at face value the assumption that it was written by Shlomo HaMelech, by King Solomon, and we take our knowledge of Shlomo's biography, his life story from start to finish, and we read that into it, it actually leads to so much more clarity in what's going on, and so much more, not only literary, but so much more depth generally around it. So that was very refreshing to see and to be able to glean from, because it really shows that at some point we can take it for face value, take it at its word, and dig in there, and there's a lot to glean.
Yeah, so, I agree. I agree with that. I think that, by the way, I should point out that I'm very interested in language. I read a lot about language. Kohelet does use fairly late biblical Hebrew. There's Aramaic borrowings, Persian borrowings. I don't have a problem with the idea that it was composed in different ways. Even the rabbis state that it was maybe that Kohelet was composed by Chizkiyahu, who was a later king, and then maybe edited by the Anshe Knesset. That's not a real issue for me. The thing that I'm focusing on, as you mentioned, is sort of what are you supposed to take away from this? And it's very difficult for me to read any other conclusion than the author, than the way the book is presented, that it's supposed to be Shlomo. It talks about a very wise king in Jerusalem who had a lot of wives, who built a lot, who had a lot of money. All these descriptions are clearly talking to me about Shlomo. And so I'm putting the historical development aside and just focusing on the book that I'm reading at the moment. And that really helped me to understand, where you can go forward and how you can, what you can take from the book.
Absolutely. So on that note, when we're talking about takeaways from the book, You obviously wrote an entire book-length survey of different connections that you have, not only within the early chapters of Bereshit, of Genesis, but even throughout the Chumash and throughout other places in Tanakh. But I'm wondering if you can just share, maybe one or two of either your favorite connections or the most exciting connections or the connections that you think would speak to most people. Obviously, we don't want to spoil the book, and everyone is welcome to order the book from Koren. I highly recommend it. But what was one or two of the connections that really stuck out to you when you were writing?
Okay, so one of the things was the structure of the book is very difficult. It's kind of all over the place. And even I found a midrash which talks about how it's not in chronological order and commentaries explaining why that was the case. But I still have found a difficult thing to understand why it was written that way, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for so many people. Um, Anyone who reads the book, especially in Hebrew, you'll pick up immediately one of the key words that repeats itself over 30 times is the word hevel,
Yep.
and that's meaning translated as futility, vanity, uh, different ways in different contexts in the book, but in English,
Futile.
futile, right? Exactly. Um, the but Hevel is also Abel, Adam's son, and that was one of the things that kind of stuck out to me. What does that mean? Why is his name of all names being repeated? So we think about Adam's fall, Adam's sin in the garden and the punishment he received after. He received a number of punishments. He and his wife both received a number of punishments, but certainly the most significant of them was the introduction of death into the world. And yet, the first person to die wasn't Adam, and it wasn't Chava, it wasn't Eve. It was Hevel, his son, which was, must have been devastating. I mean, his own flesh and blood was the person his child was the one who was punished for his sin, and so that maybe gave him a different perspective on how the way the book kind of was written. If you ever go to like a shiva, mourning house of a elderly person who passed away, oftentimes the mourners will tell stories about the person, in a very structured way, how they were young and how they're older, and it's kind of a normal thing to go. It's not that way when you go, not for us at a child who passed away. And certainly, I've never been to one where somebody felt responsible for the death of the child. That would be, I can't even imagine what that would be like. And so I imagine that basically the repetition of the word hevel, 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 everything is vain, it's all futile, is basically Shlomo's understanding of what Adam would have said. He would have been inconsolable. He just, it's not going to be an order. It's not going to be, it's just his thoughts coming out every time. That's sort of what I think the purpose of the repetition of hevel is. And it really gives it kind of helps understand why the book doesn't have the structure that many of the other biblical books do. So that was one thing that really helped me understand. It made it more difficult, it made it more challenging, but at least helped me understand why the book is not written in a more clear and laid out way. Another insight I have, and actually, as we're recording, it's almost in Kippur. So I did find that there were a lot of, the book is very considered to be oftentimes depressing, pessimistic, but I do think in Kohelet does leave a lot of room for hope. And that's because we don't ever really see either Adam or Shlomo having any how did they react to the punishment they received. They don't really have any speeches from their part. Did they try to rationalize it? Did they explain? Did they argue with God? Were they sad about it? How did they feel after? We don't see that. But I think that Kohelet is a way that we sort of see what they thought about their lives looking back. How Shlomo did it in Hezredigan, how he might have imagined Adam would react as well. And the book not only gives general advice about how to avoid some of the tragedies and downfalls that they each experience, but also hints to, as you mentioned, through other various textual connections, a number of the mitzvot, the commandments that can help prevent some of those fallings and failings. And I think Yom Kippur is actually one of the highlights of that. And I just, how I get to Yom Kippur, the book, I kind of need to read to see how it, goes from one section to another. But Yom Kippur, the service, is so echoing the fixing the mistakes, fixing both the sin in the Garden of Eden and the expulsion. You have a return in a way to the pre-sin state of Garden of Eden. You have, we don't eat the same way that we did eat from the tree. We let God determine what is right and wrong, which is similar to the way that the two goats were sent away. There's a lot of these parallels, and suddenly you have again, I brought a whole list in the book, but it gives a whole insight into the Yom Kippur service where it's not just, again, something kind of difficult for us, but actually feels like we're returning to a pre-sin state, which is kind of very inspiring. And it's nice to think that the book of Kohelet can kind of lead us to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's really, It's such important of a message. I guess leaning from that, one of the themes that has come up a lot in the book that I noticed at least was this idea that one of the things that Shlomo Melech was known for was his wisdom, his knowledge, and that let's say over his journey, that knowledge might have been used in less than ideal ways, and the Kohelet can be read as sort of a cautionary tale against. I'll read a few lines from the book where, I think that really came out as an underlying theme that you brought up. One is from the end of the first chapter. Shlomo was instructed to be like his father and did not succeed. In the end, there is no sign of Shlomo repenting, and as we shall see, there is evidence that instead of confessing his sins, he rationalized them. God has patience for those who give in to their evil inclination and sin if they repent, but rationalizations, which justify the rebellious behavior as normative, preclude any such repentance. In these cases, God is much less likely to forgive. As we shall see, this is a major lesson taught in Kohelet. Again, this comes up right here at the end of section 3, the very end of section 3. Kohelet teaches us that listening only to ourselves is an extremely dangerous path. Just as the snake convinced Adam and Chava to eat from the tree, the spies convinced the nation that the conquest of the land would not succeed, and Shlomo convinced himself that he could safely ignore the laws of the king. None thought that they were rebelling for their own sake, but they were blind to the disaster that soon followed. When we commit ourselves to following an external authority, fearing God and keeping his commandments, we have an effective balance to the evil inclination that consistently tries to tell us what is good and what is bad. So we have this theme that comes up time and again in the book that we should not be rationalizing for ourselves. We have this external authority, the Torah, that's there. It's meant to be that countermeasure precisely against our internal wants, our internal drives. And yet, part of being human, particularly part of being, let's say a thinking being, someone who has the ability to cognize, to look around the world, to realize our place into it, and to make informed decisions based on that, part of that is making, rational decisions and being able to rationalize why is this so important. In fact, the Rambam, a major project of his in the Guide for the Perplexed, was going through mitzvos and showing here's the reason for these, here's how we can understand them in a rational way. And even today, the Sefer HaChinuch, which also goes through each mitzvah and tries to explain why exactly we're doing it, is a major part of, chinuch, Jewish education. So where does our need to rationalize and our act of rationalization in service of Avodas Hashem, but also in our lives generally, so how does Kohelet respond to that, and how are we able to fit that mentality and that approach into our religious lives, even knowing how much it burned even the wisest who ever lived in its own way?
That's a great question, and there's not an easy answer, but I think it's probably the thing that we as religious Jews probably struggle with the most over the generations. That particular question of how we balance those two. Sometimes it was presented in the ways of like the tension between reason and revelation, or talking about how we understand the mitzvah, like the Rambam did, and other people oppose that approach. This is something that's been going on for a very long time, and it hasn't really resolved itself since. It has a lot to do with the questions of how we view halacha today. Is it something that can be adapted based on our modern understanding, or does it need to rely on the traditional limitations? My opinion is as follows. I think that first of all, I think it should be fairly clear that there is a need for people to have some kind of external set of laws they accept. Even if they don't necessarily think that it applies to them at that moment, they still need to follow the set of laws. If they don't have that, then we have kind of anarchy. And a couple of simple examples that you could probably give people can identify with their own lives. One would be, let's say someone's an excellent driver, and they know they can drive well above the speed limit, and they won't, and nothing will happen to them because they know they're an excellent driver. That's probably true, and most of the times they probably can drive that fast. But occasionally they won't be as careful as they need to, and that can lead to problems. And certainly other people, everyone's going to have their own time. At some point, that system is going to fail. So we have to have a speed limit that's going to apply to everyone, regardless of their own understanding of how that would best apply to them. Another example might be some of us are trying to, let's say, eat healthy, right? We can always say, well, there's a reason I can allow myself to eat this, I can eat that, and you can find a million rationalizations. And ultimately, it might be all those ideas might be true, and yet it's not going to get us to our goal of a healthier diet and a healthier lifestyle if we constantly decide when these things apply. But I don't think on a personal level that's the only message in Judaism. In other words, we have these. I've always thought that we had sort of two parallel tracks going on, almost like stereo, which gives us additional levels of balance. On the one hand, we have this internal voice. You can call it, Tzelem Elokim, that we're in God's image. It can be our Yetzer Hatov. It can be, our moral conscience, however we want to define it. And then we have these external laws. And the entire Torah is, and the Tanakh later on, and the truth is, all of Jewish literature and laws kind of focus on this, is the balance between that and these external laws we get from God. So, for example, if you look at the book of Bereshit, you have the Avot, our patriarchs, who were wonderful people, but they weren't able to achieve the success that they might have had they had these external laws. And I think that's, at least to me, a very clear reading when you read Bereshit. You see, for example, look at the stories of Yaakov. He married two wives, that didn't go well. He favored one son over another, that didn't go well. I don't think he was trying to do something bad, but he didn't have it. There was no guidance of exactly how that needed to play out. And so the Torah later came and said, don't do those things. Even if you think, even someone as amazing as Yaakov, hey, don't marry two sisters. Don't favor one son or another. And many other laws are like that. And so there's that need to understand we have to have some heteronomous external source of authority. Otherwise, we'll constantly fall into these rationalizations that I talk about in the book. But that's not the only message. There are times when we have to use our voice of that moral conscience needs to impact how we understand the halakha, because ultimately the halakha, the laws, are given over to humans. We say, not in heaven. It's the rabbis need to determine the laws, and that's something that message is also very clear. I think that, for me, I didn't really talk about the book so much, but the book of Ruth for me is a classic example of that. We have there's all kinds of laws, and yet they still need to find right ways to implement them according to the moral values that they felt were applying. So that kind of tension is going on, and I think it's very relevant to us today. When you have a halacha that deals with a sensitive issue, how do you deal with it? You can find rabbis who are trying to only let's say only follow these external laws, but maybe they were not as sensitive to some of the moral internal issues that they needed to be. And there are others who are saying, no, we really need to pay attention to these things. And maybe some people would say, oh, they're making too much sense of that. That balance is essential. It's not easy to acquire, but that's really what we need to focus on. So that's where I think is the answer. It's a difficult balance to obtain, but it's the ultimate goal of anyone trying to keep the halacha, trying to keep Jewish law.
And that's actually very relevant to the end of Kohelet, the very last verses, in fact, where it says, at the end of the day, do I don't have it in front of me to read the exact psukim, maybe offhand.
Yeah, but, just the point is to follow, to listen to God, to follow follow the commandments, and because that's what human is, right? Kizek kol adam.
Exactly.
I think it's a very important verse, by the way, and I think that's something that people miss. I don't think that Kohelet is just saying follow the commandments because you're just supposed to follow the Shulchan Aruch or follow the mitzvah, which is important in and of itself. But what he's talking about is, why do we need to do it? You mentioned the reason why we do the mitzvot. Shlomo had this very intimate relationship with God, and he lost it. He blew it. He betrayed God, and he lost that relationship. And that's something that he felt that Adam would have been able to experience as well, based on just violating God's laws. Mm-hmm. The idea of keeping the mitzvot, at least in the way I think Kohelet presents it, is not about, oh, you missed the opportunity to do mitzvah X or mitzvah Y, but rather you lost this intimate relationship you have with God. What a special thing you had, and why would you? How can it be worth it? The image I have is, let's say, a spouse, someone who betrayed their spouse and was no longer with them and regretted it, wanted to go back and think, what, for that brief moment of pleasure, they blew it all. And that's I think the message of God. If you just, if only I could have just stayed to keep that one mitzvah, whether it was Adam just did not eat the fruit from the tree, or Shlomo as a king had those few limitations, and he just kept those, he could have kept that special relationship. That's something I think we can identify with in our lives, that we have, a potential of a special relationship with God, and by keeping the framework of the commandments, we're able to maintain them. That's something very special.
Yeah, and that's particularly interesting because we talked a little about scholarship before. A lot of scholars, what they'll say is that, oh, this verse was added after the fact to try to make up for the fact that this book otherwise was so down and depressing and questioning. So they put it in there at the end to make it seem like, oh no, okay, just forget that, keep going. But the point that you're making, which is incredibly important, is that if you read the book with this in mind as a natural ending from it, it actually makes a lot of sense to end it that way, given Shlomo's, I'm tempted to call it a character arc, but given his life story and life's trajectory.
Right, I agree. I think that that's something that I also felt like, it's not tacked on. It's there the entire way. And I think part of what maybe I bring to the table with this book is that by giving it a historical context, a context of the Tanakh, how we're going to describe it, you can understand it a little better. If you focus on Shlomo, there's a lot of great books about Kohelet. I read many of them, and there's even more that have come out recently. And a lot of them view it as a philosophical work and sometimes disconnected a little bit from the historical context of who it's attributed to, what their life was like, because they say it could be something universal, it could apply to every person, and it could be, it's a philosophical work that could be available at any time. And there's value to that because Kohelet does have messages for all people. But I think by placing it in the historical context, but look at Shlomo, Shlomo, who built the Beit HaMikdash, who had this amazing gift of wisdom, who had wealth, he had fame, and he would have said, what did I gain from all that at the end of his life? So then all the cynicism that he expresses throughout the book of Kohelet is at the end of the book, he's saying, was it really worth it? Well, he really wasn't. He just wanted to be that little kid again who was asking a gift, who God offered him a gift and they had this special meeting. That's what he really wanted. It fits, like a hand in glove. That's something that's, it doesn't seem strange. If you're talking about it as a philosophical work that could be written by anyone in Europe in the 1800s or, whatever it be, then you're right. Then it's kind of weird. Why are you suddenly telling me to keep its vote when the rest of the book doesn't seem to be talking about that? But I think the historical context gives us that additional insight, which is really helpful for understanding the book.
Absolutely. So, on that note, we're going to be reading this obviously over Sukkot, which is known as Zman Simchasenu, or Zman Simchatenu, the time of our happiness, the time of our joy. So what are we doing reading such a downer of a book on Sukkot, and what should we be taking out from it? Obviously, we now have a lot of connections that we can look at, that we can see as we're reading it to figure out how it, pun intended, maps on to the rest of our broader Jewish story and the narratives that we hold so dear. But practically, lemaisa, as we would say, what should the takeaways be for us? And, what are we even doing there in the first place? How can we, dare I say, rationalize why we're about to read this book on this otherwise so joyful holiday?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that it's hard to say exactly the historical reason why Kohelet was chosen to be read at Sukkot. There's a lot of, scholarly discussions about that. I don't know exactly. It might be a little bit lost to the fog of history. But what I can say is that if I had to choose a book to read in Sukkot, I would choose Kohelet. I think it's probably the best book to read. So whether, how it happened, I don't know, but it certainly was a good choice. And I think that one of the interesting message, you mentioned a little bit the laws of the king. The king has certain restrictions upon himself. He can't have too many wives and horses and too much gold. It's interesting, if you look in Parshat Ekev, there's a set of laws where the people are warned about the dangers when in the desert, they're about to go into the wilderness, they're about to go into the land of Israel, and they're also warned about similar types of dangers. One more additional danger that they are told about, which does not include the laws of the king, is building houses. And it's basically the danger of abundance, of having affluence in the feeling of confidence that you're going to forget about God if you're in that situation. That wasn't one of the laws against the king. The king, the opposite is true. The king actually was supposed to did end up building the Beit HaMikdash, but these houses that Shlomo built, he in essence actually built his own house even before, and even in a larger scale than building the Beit HaMikdash, makes someone feel very secure and feel very confident. And that's actually the message that you need to remember on Sukkot. This is the time of the harvest. This is the time when you feel most that everything belongs to you. After all summer working in the fields, the farmer suddenly feels, the produce belongs to me, the crops are mine. And the Torah is basically saying with Sukkot, no, hold on, this is not really yours. You need to, first of all, help out others. It emphasizes you have to help out the widow and the Levite and all the poor and all these people. And you have to go to the Beit HaMikdash. All these things are going on to remind us, don't just sit and, this is not a Thanksgiving meal where you're going to sit down with a turkey in your own house and be happy. This is the time when you have to remember where the source of your blessing came from. This is doesn't really belong to you. You're not even going to be in your own house, which is the place you're most likely to enjoy the bounty. You actually have to go outside to remember what it's like. I talk a little bit more in the book, but I think it's a very important counter message to, it's not just, of course, it's Zman Simchatenu, it's a sign of our joy, but what kind of joy is that? You want Simcha Shel Mitzvah, you want the keeping of mitzvah, not what the Rambam talks about, Simchat HaKeres, the joy that you just have in your gut by just eating a lot. That's helping us direct our joy in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a really amazing idea. Rav Lichtenstein used to write quite a lot about the dangers of being a glatt kosher hedon. And so, you can eat all the food in the world. It's not kosher, so it's okay. But being able to acknowledge, what kind of happiness is this? Why are we doing it? And how does that fit in is so important for us in this time. And really, as you said, Kohelet is in many ways the perfect book to be able to get us there, both because of its subject and also, as you've demonstrated throughout this conversation and in your book, the subtext as well. What's going into that? Where's the history behind it? And it's being written from not only a place of King Solomon's great wisdom, but also his great life experiences as well, and really is something that that we read as part of the broader story of the Jewish people, showing a side that we often don't think about. So it's really amazing and really incredible. And I can say without any doubt that your book Kohelet, A Map to Eden, really gave me a new way of looking at Kohelet. I'm going to have it right next to my Chumash over the holiday as we're going through it, and I highly recommend to others as well. I'll have a link in the description if you're watching on YouTube, or the comments if you're watching on Facebook for the book if anyone is interested. And it's really phenomenal. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak. Thank you so much for writing the book. It's really been a pleasure. Is there any thoughts that you wanted to leave us with?
I just want to say, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity. I'm available, fairly easy to find me online, and I'm happy to hear thoughts, comments. Constantly. I don't ever view a book, even when it's published, the discussion is over. This is something I'm interested in. I'm interested in hearing and continue to learn from people who read it and from others who have different thoughts. So feel free to reach out to me. Happy to connect with you and continue the conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you so much again, and Chag Sameach.